Hi, I'm Charles Galda, President of Vision New England, and your host for the Church in Action program, where we talk with New England leaders about making disciples, doing justice, and sharing Jesus to accelerate evangelism and transform New England. This week, I'm talking with Gina Mueller, who is the director of 3DM North America, which is a disciple-making ministry. It serves churches of all different sizes as well as individuals. Gina's been part of the 3DM movement since 2008, has led in large church contexts, was a church planter, so she knows how to adapt the program for the different contexts in which she serves, and recently moved to Maine, so not that far from me, but right in New England. So Gina, great to have you with us.
Good to be with you.
And thanks for being a Mainer, a Down Easter, I guess.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Gina, as you know, we've been spending the first 3 months of this year talking about the criticality of making disciples. And in these conversations, we talk about the hallmarks of disciples, thinking that it's good to know what we're aiming for.
Yeah.
And so what we've been using as those hallmarks is people who are biblically literate, sorry, not biblically illiterate, biblically literate, evidence the fruits of the Spirit, and are showing evidence of being transformed continually to be more like Jesus. Is that a good operating definition, or would you tweak or add or delete?
I feel like those are strong components for sure, because we don't just want converts, right? We want actual disciples who are truly following Jesus, who converts just believe in Jesus, right?
Mm-hmm.
Converts believe that God is real. Whereas disciples are learning how to be radically obedient to the ways of Jesus. Mm-hmm. I think the challenge for us, or the hard part for us, is that in general, the church has focused on knowledge-based discipleship. And less so on obedience-based discipleship. And so what we have today is we've got lots of people inside of our churches who have done lots of things like Bible studies. They've heard sermon after sermon. And so they've collected lots of information, but they haven't necessarily put it into practice. And so if following Jesus really is making Jesus the leader of our life, we want people to fall so in love with Jesus that they're willing to do anything for him, right? Yeah. And so that includes things like loving the least, the last, the lost, and the lonely. And I feel like as I think about discipleship, what I love is that there's so many parallels between discipleship and parenting or raising kids. Mm-hmm. And I feel like for me as a parent, my goal is to raise confident, competent, responsible adults who move out, right? And they actually start their own families. And so everything that I do as a parent is really to help them get ready for that. And that feels similar to me in making disciples. I think sometimes we forget that multiplication and reproduction is really the goal. And so the thing that I would add, I think, is the multiplication piece, that every disciple multiplies or makes more disciples.
So they do it too.
Absolutely.
Right? And it's interesting you say that, because, well, two things you made me think of. One is when you talk about we've been focused more on knowledge-based discipleship, so we didn't do a great job on the transformational discipleship. So we focused on knowledge-based discipleship. And based on the high level of biblical illiteracy, it would seem we weren't doing a great job there in some cases too.
It's tricky, right? It's hard. Yeah.
Right. And the other thing is this now you do it piece. Has come up in a couple of our conversations. Gordon MacDonald, I think, was the first one to raise it. And he put it in the context of the rabbinical contract. So what Jesus is doing with the rabbis was a methodology known in their day. And it was, and at some point it ends now. And if you're going to continue growing, you need to go do that.
That's exactly right. Exactly right.
That's an important one for us to hear, as was this nuance you just teased out too, of there's a difference between a believer and a disciple.
Yeah.
And so can you just say that again? I want to make sure we hear that.
Yeah, I feel like we don't just want converts who believe in Jesus or believe that God is real. We want disciples who are followers of Jesus. And that means they're learning to reorient their lives around the way of Jesus.
Now, why is that important?
Boy, I feel like everything for me is how did Jesus do it, right? I feel like there's the obvious thing of Jesus said, go and make disciples. He didn't say go and make converts.
And he didn't say go. Some of us hear go and we think missions. Right?
Absolutely.
There's some words after go.
That's right. Yep. And I think some of the awkward part is that sometimes we think it's go and build the church, but Jesus said, make disciples, and his job is building the church. And so what feels important for me as I'm thinking about discipleship, especially here, honestly, in the New England context, is discipleship is Jesus's strategy for reaching the world. And I think sometimes we think about discipleship as like an inward self-growth strategy to make us better Christians. But it was literally Jesus's strategy to reach the world. I don't think we can escape the missional impulse of his discipleship strategy and what that produced. I heard someone say recently that every generation is a new Great Commission. So every new generation, they get to figure out what it looks like to bring the good news to every single person living on the planet in this very moment. And that feels interesting to me.
And so why is it, and I think you touched on something that is important to us, because you talk about, especially in New England, right? So New England is different. It's not always as different as we like to think it is, but there's a lot of unique differences in New England that it's a minefield if we don't know them.
Yep.
And so why is it important in New England? What I heard you say is, to do effective evangelism, you need to be a disciple. Am I reading too much into what you're saying, or is that fair?
No, I think the language that I like to use is, again, for me, it always goes back to the way of Jesus. What do we see in Jesus's life and leadership and what that produced? And what I see when Jesus made disciples, his disciples were missionaries. That's what his investment and his discipleship in their lives produced. And so for me, I feel like we've separated those two things somewhere along the line. And so we feel like discipleship is one thing and like being a missionary is a different thing. But when I look at the Gospels and what Jesus's discipleship strategy produced, to me, being a disciple means that you are a missionary, that those two things are synonymous, that they go together.
Right, which is the go part, right? As you're going, make disciples. And it does remove some of our excuses around evangelism, because if you think about our evangelism, if Barna's right, 85% of evangelicals will not share their faith with anybody this year.
Yeah.
And one leader told me, so of course not, we don't love people enough.
Oof.
And right, I know, right? And it's hard to argue with that, because we let other things get in the way of being a disciple. Means I love and I'm willing to disadvantage myself.
That's right.
Right. And if I'm a disciple, I don't get to say, well, I'm afraid, right? Because somebody else said, well, that fear doesn't come from God. Right. And then there's I don't know enough. And like, well, aren't we supposed to know what Jesus taught? Right. And so it kind of is, if we're serving as a disciple, it kind of knocks down our excuses to tell people about Jesus, doesn't it?
It does. Yeah. I think the challenge is, here's what I see. The challenge is, the way that we've been doing church is we put an expert at the center. And so I feel like from the time someone becomes a believer, or if they've grown up in church, we're constantly reinforcing the idea that it's actually the experts do all of that. So you have to know enough before you start teaching someone else, or you have to, it's the people who go to seminary who can actually understand scripture. And so I feel like, unfortunately, the way that we've been doing church, and sometimes that's inherited, we inherited that model, but I feel like sometimes the way that we've been doing church actually reinforces the idea that everyday people can't do it.
It's a great point. I was just meeting with some pastors yesterday, and we're talking about, for some of us, evangelism is I invite my friend to church. And there's nothing wrong with inviting your friend to church, but my job is get them there. Now, pastor, that's your job, right? Discipling my children is getting them to the youth group. Now, pastor, that's your job, right? And so we farm out all of this work, and that's not the model that Jesus would say. So is it fair to say the Great Commission is not merely a collective command to go make disciples, but an individual command, is what I'm hearing you say too?
Here's the thing. I would say that it's both, but I'm going to define the collective a little bit differently, because I don't think that it's the institution of church. I don't think it's the church's job in terms of what happens inside of a building. But I do think that it's both. It is our individual, the ways that we're leaning into following Jesus includes being a missionary. So I don't think, when I look at the Gospels, I just don't see a whole lot of wiggle room around that being the way that Jesus made disciples turned them into missionaries. So I think that there is an invitation and even a command, right? Jesus says, go and make disciples. and teach them how to obey. So there is a personal invitation for us in that, which I think to each one of us individually is what feels challenging for all the reasons that you named, right? I think there's so many people that are like, I don't know how to have a spiritual conversation with my neighbor.
Right.
I don't feel equipped to do those things. And so there's an individual challenge for us to join Jesus in what he's already doing in the world around us, right? That's the individual piece. But here's what's interesting to me. When I look at every time Jesus sent the disciples out, he always sent them in pairs. So there's something communal to me about the way that Jesus sent them on mission. And there seemed to be this like community that as they're engaging with the people who weren't yet following God around them, they were actually inviting them into like an extended spiritual family kind of environment. So this is the invitational part. It feels challenging to us as individuals to go on mission because of all of the reasons that we've named. However, when we see mission as a team sport, meaning we go together, like we've got people that that have the same vision and they're on mission with us. What that means is I don't have to have every single gift, spiritual gift, personality trait, answer to every question, because if I invite somebody who doesn't know Jesus around other believers who frankly aren't going to be weird with non-Christians, right? If we've got a family that's going on mission together and I trust them with my non-Christian friends, with my friends, that don't yet know Jesus, what happens is there's an invitational part of us being able to go together. Does that make sense? It feels like it's both an individual and a communal kind of thing. Where I don't get a pass, but mission gets to be a team sport also.
That's a great point. And so how much do you see the notion of, well, look, I'm biblically literate, and now I want to tell you about Jesus, but I'm missing things like the evidence of the fruit of the Spirit, or the things I'm posting on social media, which shock, right? Would shock Jesus for sure. So that the life doesn't match up with, how much does that get in the way?
That's a great question. Because here's the challenge. None of us are perfect. All of us are going to be on a journey with Jesus till the day that we die. But character matters. And so part of our discipleship journey is the character piece of us honestly submitting to the lordship of Jesus in all of those areas, where his priorities become our priorities, where being a disciple means that over time we learn to sound like Jesus, think like Jesus, talk like Jesus, become who Jesus would be if he were us. And so the character stuff matters because we want people who are far from God to experience the kingdom of God when they're with us. Right. So the character stuff matters.
It's a great
100%.
And so we've talked about some of the challenges and issues we see out there. What is 3DM doing in this space?
Yeah. So our methodology is, I feel like it's simple. There's no new shiny thing, right? Unfortunately, there's not a silver bullet. I wish there was.
We'd like a 6-week program that I can implement next week and we're done, right?
Exactly. But to beat the drum, for me, it always goes back to the way that Jesus did things. So here's what I see. Jesus picked a few and he gave them everything that he got, that he had, right? So if we were to, the way that we encourage people to make disciples is pick a few and really invest in them, like really disciple them, not invite them into a group that's an hour and a half per week or whatever it is, right? But you're really inviting them into your life and actually disciple them and then train them how to do the same thing with other people. At 3DM, we use simple tools. We found that if you're gonna train people how to do things like hear God's voice and take radical steps of obedience, or truly reorient your life around the way of Jesus, which means recognizing the people in your life that are far from God and knowing how to have spiritual conversation. Like, we need simple tools so that it's not just the experts that can do it, that everyday people can do it. So I feel like simple tools is really helpful yes, so people can do it, but also so that everyday people can teach other people how to do it. So that's part of the strategy for us. And so for us, it's both coming alongside of the everyday person so that they can get traction in becoming more like Jesus and learning how to do the things that Jesus did, but also coming alongside churches and ministries and denominations to actually help them either shift culture if they're an existing kind of church, or if they're planting a new ministry or church, help them create culture. But what we want them to create is this discipling culture where what they're producing are disciples who are a whole lot more like the kind of disciples that Jesus made.
You just hit on something. We've heard, I think, from almost every one of our guests so far, is that this is a culture change in your church. It's not a program, it's not a class, and it's not something you talked about 2 Sundays from the pulpit and now it's solved.
I wish it were that easy. I wish.
If it was, we'd be doing it a lot better,
That's
right?
That's right.
And so, but it is a years-long effort.
Yes.
And a lifetime effort. And so what are some of the tools you would talk about? Give us some examples of what you mean by tools.
Yeah. So we, one of the tools is it's a triangle, which again sounds funny. It's a triangle. The thing about that is it's showing people up in and out, which is another way of saying what does a Jesus-shaped life look like? We see Jesus pursuing relationship with the Father. That's in the up dimension. So growing a life of prayer. Carving out time to be with the Father, learning how to dig for God's presence ourselves. That's the up dimension. The in dimension is growing a radical kind of shared life community sort of thing, like vulnerable community, discipling people. That's like the inward component of believers of the church. The outward component is Jesus never lost sight of his mission to seek and save the lost. So how do we train believers to have this outward component where they're living on mission and joining God in what he's already doing?
It's easy for us to miss in the language in the Gospels when people are going to be with Jesus. That the word there, I remember in at least John, the word's abide, right? I want to abide with you, right? It's not just I'm going to come along, right? On Tuesdays at noon, right?
That's right. Yeah.
We're going to do life together.
That's right.
Which I've thought back a couple of times since we've been having these conversations about the necessity of relationship to accountability. Yeah. And so Gina, you can't tell me I'm selfish without risking breaking our relationship, right? Because I'm not going to be your friend anymore now.
That's right.
But if we know and love each other, you get to tell me things like that I don't see about myself.
Yeah.
That I probably need to hear. I think I'm selfish. I don't think I'm 30 years as a Christian. Anybody's ever told me I'm selfish. They probably should. But they've got to have the kind of relationship where I can hear that and trust that.
Yeah.
And that's, I think in our busy workaday life, those relationships are limited for us if they exist at all.
Yeah.
And so what do you say to me though? I'm like, okay, well, Gina, I love this idea of being with people and really investing in them. But I'm busy. I got a job. I keep the nursery at church. And I'm an introvert on top of it. And so
love that excuse.
Right. Yeah. So what do you say to me?
We use the analogy of the rocks in the jar. I'm sure that you've seen kind of that in-person analogy where you've got the big rocks and you've got the small rocks. And if you put all the small rocks into the jar first, then the big rocks don't fit, right? But if you put the big rocks in the jar first, then all the small rocks will filter down around it. Yeah. And I think here's the thing, all of us are busy. The question is, do our priorities line up with the priorities of Jesus? And the alignment part is the discipleship journey. Aligning our lives with the priorities of Jesus is sometimes painful. It requires hard decisions. We're redeciding how we spend our time, who we spend our time with. It's kind of like going to the orthodontist and getting braces. It's the alignment part when we're being realigned. It hurts sometimes, and that's the discipleship journey, is realigning our lives and our priorities around the way of Jesus. So the question is, what are the big rocks in the jar, and what's the filter that we're using for making some of those decisions?
Right. And a lot of that is there's a lot of demands placed on me that I'm responding to, as opposed to figuring out the big rocks first. right?
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
saying, well, now if I have those figured out, I can say no to some of those demands
Yeah.
and accept there's a trade-off, right, and
Right.
implications to that, but recognize there's also a trade-off and implications if you don't,
Yeah.
right? And is it so the triangle, going back to the triangle for a second, that
Sure.
sounds like, hey, this is a way to think about things and a way to
Yeah.
start to crystallize some concepts in our lives. And is that most of the tools that you're going to have? Is it stuff to force us to think about things differently, or are there tools about, like, how do I figure out who I should be doing this with, and what does it look like when we get together versus just we had a nice lunch? Are there some tools around that too?
All of it,
Okay.
Charles, all of it. I feel like so there's the super simple tools that we're
Mhm.
training everyday people with. Things like the learning circle helps train people how to hear God's voice and
Mhm.
actually respond to it, to do the things, take risky steps of obedience to the things that they're hearing God say. We have the leadership square that actually teaches us how to multiply ourselves to make more
Mhm.
leaders. Rather than just make more converts or whatever. We've got the semicircle that teaches people rest and work, how to lean both into covenantal relationships but also kingdom purpose.
Mhm.
And so all of that, as we take churches through a process of culture shift, we engage churches in all sorts of things to help them assess the kind of culture that, like, what's their starting place, what's their what is, and help them get really clear on that so that they can create a strategy towards shifting towards, what could be, what will be.
It's interesting, and so far, it just dawned on me in all of our conversation on this so far that you and I have had, I have not heard you once say what I do on Sunday morning, right? I'm hearing you talk about what I do in my neighborhood,
Everyday
my
stuff.
friends, my work, right? It's
Yeah.
it's not about Sunday morning.
It's not, but here's the thing. Some people would hear that and say, "Well, you don't care about the church. Like, you're throwing
Mhm.
out the model of the church and making the assumption that the gathered people of God is no longer valid or valuable." And I
Mhm.
would say that's not true. What we see in the New Testament is this rhythm of temple and home. So
Mhm.
both of them are super important to the strategy. I think we've overemphasized temple. And so we've got to bring a course correction and teach people how to do this in their homes and in their neighborhoods and in their workplaces. And so it doesn't mean that what happens in the temple no longer matters, but it means that the priorities probably change. And so if we're relying on experts, I think we've inherited a model that says everything happens inside the church building where the expert, the pastor, the professional Christian is going to feed all the people. And so the role of the pastor is, to take care of everybody, to feed all the people. And what that's
And
produced,
completely unrealistic.
yes, absolutely. Yeah. But what that's produced is spiritual consumers who will continue to consume all of the wonderful goods and services that we provide for them.
Yeah.
But what we need to teach people how to do is actually take responsibility for their faith, to learn how to hear God's voice for themselves, to learn how to dig in scripture and understand the context and teach other people, to grow healthy community, to live on mission amongst their neighbors and, their kids' friends and all of the things. Which actually creates kingdom producers. So there's a culture shift that has to take place. And so it's not that Sunday morning no longer matters, but the purpose changes. Where
Mhm.
now it's a gathering place for all the missionaries to gather, where they can celebrate what God's doing out in the world. They can worship together. They're hungry for God's presence together, but it's also a training space where we can send them back out. Where the game is played out there. It's kind of like the locker room. The game is actually played out there.
I know you work with all different age groups,
Yeah,
but can you speak briefly, and then I want to come back with one thing as we start to wrap up, but can you
sure.
speak briefly about seniors? Because I hear from so many seniors, well, there's nothing useful I can contribute at this point. And so how do you respond to that?
Um, uh, Here's the thing. I don't think there's any such thing as retiring in the kingdom.
Hmm.
I think that there is a consistent invitation for us to join God in what He's already doing around us until the day that we die. There is so much rich wisdom and life experience that seniors have to offer other people, where they can be powerful disciplers. But the other thing that they can do is invest in the next move of God.
Yeah.
What we don't want to do is make an assumption that the next generation's move of the Spirit or move of God is going to look exactly the same as the way God moved in our generation.
Great.
So what we have to get really good at is helping every generation invest in the next generation and the next move of God. Yeah.
Yeah, it's it seems to me that we've got so much loneliness, and we've got these young people who desperately want mentors. We've got all this wisdom in our seniors,
Right.
and somehow that we can't connect them. Right,
Yeah.
there's something broken there, and so if you could, I'd love to hear two more things. We got about 2 minutes left, Gina. If How do you know this is working, and then how do folks learn more?
Okay. How we know it's working. I feel like some of the things that I'd be looking for is when it's not just built around the experts, when we are actually training and releasing everyday people to do the work of the kingdom, where you're starting to see followers of Jesus actually living like Jesus, where they're actually taking bold and risky steps that you never would have predicted, because it's not about filling them into a volunteer role, right? And training them for a volunteer role, but actually helping them step into the fullness of their identity and purpose. But I think the other thing is we start to see progress looks like people who are far from God are meeting Jesus in tangible ways through these everyday people. And they're choosing to follow Jesus, becoming disciples, and we're training them how to reach their family and friends with the good news of Jesus that actually transformed their life too.
Amen. Amen. And so if I'm listening, this sounds great to me, either for my church or for me individual, or how do I find out more, plug in? What do I do?
Absolutely. You can head over to 3dmovements.com and check out 3DM, all the things that we're doing here in New England, across the Northeast, and really across North America.
So 3D Movements, the number 3, letter D, movements.com.
Correct.
And if you can't find that, go to visionnewengland.org. Our resource page has a connection that you can get them, or email me. We'll get you hooked up, because this is an important thing. Gina, thanks so much for your ministry and for taking time to be with us today to tell us about it and how we can be making disciples. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Glad to be here.
Thanks. I'd also like to thank our producer, Jessica Mangano, and I'd like to thank our listeners. We hope this discussion helps make us better be the people of God who do the work of God, which transforms lives in the world. You can find more resources and past episodes at visionnewengland.org, and you can help us accelerate evangelism in New England by clicking on Donate. Our program is brought to you by our friends at the Luis Palau Association, who are dedicated to proclaiming the good news, uniting the church, and impacting cities worldwide.